Hi, I'm Adam Myers, and I'll be talking about ransomware threat landscape today. I've been at CrowdStrike for almost 10 years now. I helped launch the company way back when. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years working in the defense industrial base with a variety of civilian intelligence community and military customers across the US federal government. I spent a number of years supporting the US Department of State and got to really kind of focus on tracking threat actors in that capacity. And I run a team of about 150 threat intel professionals here at CrowdStrike who focus on tracking various threat actors across the world. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking a lot about these threat actors and how the ransomware threat landscape has changed over the last year. When we first started CrowdStrike back in 2011, a lot of the companies that were out there, a lot of the predominant thinking was that you needed to focus on malware. You needed to focus on those threats that were existing all over the world and that were most prevalent in the various environments that were being monitored. And as we were launching the company, we had this kind of realization that it's not really about the malware, it's about the threat actor because they're trying to accomplish some goal. And back in 2010, the name of the game in security was really to focus on the most prevalent threats and to really go after the things that are going to be found in the most environments using signature-based detection. We realized that those smaller incidents, the ones that weren't very prevalent, the unique aspects of these attacks were the things that really made them interesting and were the most expensive for potential customers, most expensive for organizations that are trying to conduct business and to operate. And by focusing on those events and those types of threat actors, then we could better protect businesses and enterprise. And when we launched, we had this saying that you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And today we track over 154 adversaries across the world who are engaged in a variety of different activities. And our belief is that by understanding who these threat actors are, how they operate, and what they're after, you're going to be in a better position to defend your enterprise, defend your environment from them. So we look at threat actor motivation as a way to kind of characterize or categorize the various threats. Ultimately, we'd love to be able to get to the point where we understand exactly who's behind this activity, what military unit or geolocation they're in, or what their name is, but that's not always possible. And so for us, we begin all analysis and investigation by looking at the motive. What is a threat actor after? What is their behavior? And by categorizing them using that model, then we're in a better understanding of kind of what we're dealing with. So the first categorization that we look at is nation state. This is associated with a government who's conducting offensive cyber operations for one reason or another. Generally, this would involve espionage. It could be sabotage, disruptive or destructive attack. And in some cases, we're increasingly seeing them engage in even e-crime or financially motivated attack. North Korea, Iran, those that have been dealing with increasing sanctions and financial difficulties as a result of what's going on have turned to e-crime to generate additional revenue, either authorized in the case of North Korea or unauthorized in the case of other countries. The second category that we track is e-crime. This is financially motivated activity. Years ago, this was almost entirely tracked under things like banking Trojans that were trying to steal credentials, get access to information, and monetize that in some way. Increasingly over the last 2 or 3 years, this has almost exclusively been driven by ransomware activity. And we're seeing even some of those traditional threat actors who were engaged in bank fraud and account takeovers are actually moving into ransomware because it has become so much more profitable. And in addition to that, over the last 18 months or so, we've seen that more of these threat actors are engaging in further extortion by stealing information and threatening to disclose it if their demands are not met or they're not paid. And so they're looking to increase the cost to the victim. And the final category that we look at is something that we call hacktivism. This is a kind of catch-all for all activity that doesn't fit into e-crime or nation state. This is activism, nationalism, terrorism, hacktivism, generally related to things that are politically motivated, or could be anything ranging from anti-capitalism to things here in the US, for example, defunding the police, et cetera. even animal rights and animal testing have been factors that have been used by hacktivist actors to conduct distributed denial of service attacks or disruptive attacks like website defacements in order to bring attention to a particular political issue. Once we are looking at something and we kind of fit it into one of these buckets or categories, then we have the ability to start talking a little bit more about who this threat actor is and what they're interested in. At CrowdStrike, we track threat actors using a cryptonym model. We have 2 names that will typically be assigned to a threat actor. So in the case of all criminal actors, it's something Spider. If you're familiar with TrickBot, that would be Wizard Spider, or Dridex and BitPaymer are all tracked under Indrix Spider, who, as a result of the US Department of Justice indictment, we have a lot of visibility into the actual individuals behind that. There's an individual named Maxim Yakubets who has been famously photographed driving fancy cars around Moscow, and he's associated with this group, which is also known as Evil Corps. So all of these different criminal actors are engaged in some form of financially motivated activity. Chinese threat actors, we track under Panda. This is associated with the Chinese nation state with a nexus to China, whether that be a military organization, intelligence organization, or a contractor working at the behest of the country. Iran we track as Kitten. North Korea we track as Cholima. Russia we track as Bear. India, Pakistan as Tiger and Leopard, respectively. Activist, hacktivist, nationalist, and terrorist groups we track as Jackal. And there's been some newer entrants on the offensive cyber operations side from a nation state perspective. Vietnam, who we've tracked for some time now, has been engaged in increasing activity that is of interest to organizations who are in automotive, healthcare, and also South Korea has been observed conducting intrusions as well. All of these threats that you see here, there's 154 or so that we actively track. And then we also have what we call activity clusters. So we don't necessarily know enough to attribute it to a specific nation state or a particular adversary, but we'll track it as an activity cluster, which is kind of like a temporary holding space as we're trying to sort out all of the details of, is this nation state, and if so, which nation is it? Now, 154 threat actors might seem like a pretty insurmountable thing to be tracking, to be worried about to protect your enterprise. But the good news is that not all of those threat actors are necessarily coming after your organization or enterprise. So if you understand what geographic locations you're concerned about, what business verticals you're concerned about, then you can look at the activity that's tracked by these threat actors and understand their capabilities, what they can do, and their intentions, what they want to do. And so as we populate this chart, looking at generally kind of threat actor activity against the West, particularly the United States, you can see that there's a pretty good sampling of different capabilities and intentions, but where these things change and move depends on what business vertical or geolocation you're specifically looking at. In general, from a Western perspective, the 3 most prevalent threats that we see are North Korea, China, and Russia. Iran used to, for example, be much lower in terms of intentions. Their capabilities haven't changed much. They've always been pretty much in the same spot. But because of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, they were lower in terms of their intentions of targeting the West. They were more focused on regional targeting of things like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But as a result of escalating tensions, we had the breakup of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We have the tanker wars in the summer of 2019 in the Strait of Hormuz, and we have this increase of tension between the two countries. Iran's intentions to target the West go up and really culminates in January of 2020 with the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. And as that threat landscape changes, we see Iran moving up and up and up in terms of intentions. And so you always have to be reevaluating these threats and understanding how they're changing and how you're changing and what the what that will do in terms of the threat. Now, it's interesting to note that almost all of these threat actors in the course of 2020 used COVID-19 in their themology in their attacks. They used it for wars, they used it for file names, and they even targeted data related to COVID-19. So as we are coming out of the grips of this global pandemic, you can see that this has really created a lot of activity and a lot of opportunity for these threat actors to increase the success of their targeting, which is some of the things we're going to look at here. So in 2020, ransomware operations for most organizations became the most disruptive threat that we were tracking. And it's important to understand that ransomware is part of a broader ecosystem. There's this global ecosystem, an underground economy, if you will, that is kind of feeding off of each other. And there's different pieces of this underground economy that will focus on different areas. They specialize in different things, all meant to generate revenue for the operators. So if you look at the breakdown, we have service-oriented aspects of this underground economy. You have access brokers. Access brokers are a tremendous utility for ransomware actors who want to find interesting targets and start off with access. So an access broker will use vulnerabilities, they'll hack in, and then they'll sell that access to the highest bidder. And ransomware actors will use this to figure or identify organizations that they're most interested in, and then buy access and start their operation. We also have lots of different elements of the underground economy. There's things like DDoS tools that are sold, ransomware as a service, so you can actually buy the malware, and malware packing services, website injection kits, spam networks. All of these different services help kind of threat actors continue their operations. And in terms of distribution, how do you get your ransomware? How do you get your malware out there? There's a whole set of actors that focus on distribution. They do social network spam, they do email spam, they're building exploit kits and operating them, they're selling installs to the highest bidder. And then finally, there's the monetization side. So you have money mules that are helping to move money around for the threat actors. You have ransom payment extortion services. You've got money laundering. So there's lots of ways that threat actors can leverage different things to monetize what they're doing. And all of these things, the services, the distribution, and the monetization, make up the underground economy, which we spend a lot of time thinking about here at CrowdStrike. So as we think about what ransomware actors are using for initial access, there's really a couple of things that they focus on. The first is banking Trojans. A lot of the threat actors that we're tracking today that are prevalent in the ransomware space have pivoted. They've moved from conducting bank fraud into now conducting ransomware attacks. Dridex is a good example, as is TrickBot, two very well-known banking Trojans that were engaged in a lot of account credential theft, injecting into browsers to steal credentials for banking and credit cards and such. And they realized that there was a lot more money to be made on the ransomware several years ago. And so they've pivoted and they use their banking Trojans, which are widely distributed in many environments today, and use that as the initial foothold. And once they have that initial foothold, they can escalate privilege, move laterally, and deploy ransomware, steal files, and conduct an attack where they can get paid tens of millions of dollars just for one intrusion. The other thing that we have is distribution actors. So we have MalwareSpider and MummySpider. MummySpider famously tied to the Emotet botnet, which is used for spam. And so what they actually do is they distribute their malware. And once they have their malware planted on a system through spam, then they'll sell access to these other e-crime actors who want to conduct ransomware attacks. So they'll buy access from MummySpider. They're on, they can deploy their tools and carry out their operation. Access brokers, which I mentioned earlier, MalwareSpider is one, but there's a lot of info stealers that are used to steal information that can be used by these threat actors. And also, they'll sell access. So if they find a remotely exploitable service and they break in or they get in through some other campaign, they'll actually sell that access in a forum. And when the criminal actor is browsing the forum, they find a target of interest, they buy the access, and they're off and running. And the last piece here is that exploitable remote services have been very prevalent this year. We've seen a tremendous amount of exploits for various VPN appliances and software. We've seen a lot of misuse of RDP, which potentially was deployed as a result of organizations trying to rapidly adopt a digital strategy in the wake of COVID. And recently, we've seen the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, which have been of great use for a lot of these remote exploitation attacks. So once these threat actors get in, whether it be through an access broker, a bank Trojan, or some other service, they're typically living off the land. By living off the land, they're using things like RDP to hop between hosts. They're using Cobalt Strike or Windows utilities that are present on the system, or systems internals tools that might be present or at least look like legitimate administrator activity. And then they'll do exfiltration using things like Mega and Rclone in order to steal files that they'll then further leak on a dedicated leak site in order to monetize that data as well. And so a lot of the tools that they're using aren't necessarily going to trigger a lot of alerts in your environment or things that people might look too closely at. If you take a look at how COVID-19 affected the e-crime ecosystem, you can take a sense here that there's been a pretty massive spike. So January, February is we're first learning about this novel coronavirus. There's not too much activity, though it starts to go up in February. But by March, we see a 100-fold increase in the number of files that had COVID-19 or coronavirus in it, or emails or links that we were tracking. So threat actors really in the course of the last year have utilized COVID-19 coronavirus to their advantage to supercharge their attacks and to get victims to click on files and to click on links in order to enable their activity. So the most active data leak sites, as we're tracking these criminal actors and their activity, they are creating these dedicated leak sites, and they'll put little pieces of 10, 15% of the stolen information on this website to demonstrate almost like a proof of life that, yes, we've compromised this victim, we have this data, and we're going to leak more of it if we don't get paid. And we see this time and time again. And the three most prevalent threat actors that are engaged in this, Twisted Spider, which is known for their Maze or egregor ransomware, Wizard Spider, which has been using Conti. So they have different tools that they use in different scenarios. Wizard Spider uses Ryuk very heavily for ransomware attacks, but we have never seen Ryuk get used for a data leak attack. We've only seen it for pure ransomware attacks. When there's a data leak attack, typically they're using something like Conti. And then Pinchy Spider with REvil, which was previously associated with the GandCrab ransomware as a service. And so it's another interesting point to understand here is that some of these threat actors, Twisted Spider, Pinchy Spider, use more ransomware as a service. But with ransomware as a service, they're effectively building the ransomware, and they'll build the platform. So you take the ransomware, you deploy it into the victim environment, and when they pay through the platform, the victim pays through the platform, the operator of that service takes some percentage. It's a revenue share model. And so they'll take some percentage of that payment as payment for what they're providing in terms of service. So that is one model by which these ransomware actors operate. The second model is that they're running the operation entirely themselves. So they'll buy access, they'll deploy their tools, they'll conduct the ransom negotiation, and then they take all 100% of the profits. The most targeted sectors over the last year that we've observed are really industrials and engineering, manufacturing, and technology. And probably state and local government and healthcare would come just on the heels of that. This is an interesting set of targets. One of the reasons that we believe that this is occurring is that ransomware actors look for organizations that have to be up and running, what I would call an operational imperative. And if they need to be up and running, at some point, there's going to be a discussion about, is it cheaper or is it more beneficial to just pay the ransom amount than to try to restore from backup or try to figure out some way around paying? And organizations like industrials and engineering, manufacturing, technology companies, there's downtime associated with this. And for every minute of downtime, there's an associated loss. And what the ransomware actor, the threat actor, is hoping is that they can hit that sweet spot where there's more money being lost than they're asking for. And so organizations are going to just pay them. As we look at the threat actors that were able to really kind of use COVID-19 as a driver for what they're doing, there's three that come to mind. Traveling Spider, which is known for their Nemtsy malware. And they were using email subjects to get organizations to open up attachments, click on links, such as general meeting for coronavirus, or impersonating healthcare organizations when they're targeting different organizations or entities in order to get their tools deployed so they can conduct a ransom attack. And they heavily targeted government and healthcare sectors over the last year. Circus Spider is the second one, and they've compromised at least one US local public health district site. They also reportedly had compromised a number of hospitals in Europe with COVID-themed emails, and they're known for their NetWalker malware, which goes by many different names. And then thirdly is Graceful Spider, and they're best known for their Get and Go loader, which is a macro document, and they were using COVID-19 lures to get organizations to open up the attachment, enable the macro, and let things get going. And they typically were using spam to distribute these documents and focusing on the pharmaceutical sector over the last year. And they're one of the ones that were most prevalent in the leak space, where they're using their Clop leak site in order to generate fear and get these organizations to pay. And they claimed that they were not targeting healthcare, but they continued to target healthcare. So when we think about ransomware and why this is such a prevalent threat, it kind of begs the question of how did we get here? And so as a brief history of ransomware, I think we can roll back. Now, ransomware has been around for a lot longer than this time period. In fact, I think the first piece that I could find of ransomware goes back to the late 80s. But if we want to talk about the modern era of ransomware, it really goes back to CryptoWall, CryptoLocker, 2014 timeframe. In fact, you can see here one of the earlier ransom demands that we looked at. And in this case, they're looking for $500. And if you didn't pay in a certain period of time, they would double the amount of money. If you wanted to pay them, it would go up to 1,000. And they asked you to pay them in cryptocurrency and so forth. And this targeted individuals. So this would get onto your computer, mom and dad's computer, whoever's computer it might be, and it would lock the system up. It would encrypt the files, and in order to unlock the system, decrypt your files, you had to pay them. And I think that they realized pretty quickly that this was very expensive for them to operate. Dealing with individuals, getting them to understand how to use cryptocurrency and how to use Tor to get onto the payment portals was absolutely an expensive proposition. And they had to do it in multiple languages. They were effectively running an international help desk in order to do this. By 2016, we were kind of calling it the year of ransomware in terms of individuals. And I was even asked to testify before the Senate Judiciary as it pertained to ransomware and why we were seeing this ransomware and what could be done about it. And there was something that was in the testimony that I want to call out, which was that we said that threat actors have likely taken note that victims such as hospitals have paid ransoms in the tens of thousands of dollars in order to recover their data, prompting them to look for victims who provide critical services to target. And as I said before, they're looking for critical services. They're looking for things that have an operating imperative. And at least one actor at that time, we call that, had begun conducting targeted ransomware attacks, which is what we today call big game hunting or enterprise ransomware. After this testimony, about a year later, the NHS in the UK gets hit by ransomware. And this is massively disruptive. This was something that locked up their systems, was a huge attention getter, the fact that there was a National Health Service that was hit by this ransom activity. And this brought a lot of attention to the NHS and to ransomware as a threat. And just 2 months later, they get hit a second time. So the initial ransom attack that hit them was the WannaCry attack, which was associated with North Korea. 2 months later, the same victim is attacked by Indrix Spider using Dridex and BitPaymer. BitPaymer is a custom locker used by the Indrix Spider actor, which has been used for many years now. 2017 was one of the first instances of that being used, and really brought attention to the fact that ransomware had gone from targeting individuals to targeting enterprises. As we look at the ransomware payment in 2019, you can see that it started off, going from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and by 2019, we start to routinely see millions and millions of dollars in ransom demands. $1 million for Maze, 2.3 for Doppelpaymer, Ryuk asking for 12.5. And this is consistent now. In fact, we see tens of millions of dollars in ransom demands, 30, 40, 50, $60 million, not uncommon in ransom demands anymore. And organizations are paying. And as a result, these threat actors are further emboldened, and they're conducting more and more intrusions in order to generate more revenue. In fact, in September of 2020, we observed one ransom demand for $1.4 billion, which was certainly the highest ransom demand we've ever seen. And since we haven't really seen anything that high, but it gives you a sense of the fact that these threat actors really think that they can get away with charging millions and millions of dollars day in and day out in order to generate revenue. So where is this going? What do we think is next on the agenda with these ransom actors? Well, one of the things that we've observed and we've blogged a little bit about is that we've seen these threat actors diversifying what they're targeting. They're not just targeting workstations or servers anymore. They're aware of the fact that a lot of organizations are using encrypted disks or using ESXi or virtual machines in order to optimize their data centers. And so these threat actors have begun looking at the virtual machine environments that they're landing in and figuring out ways to shut down those virtual machines and then encrypt the virtual disk so that you need to decrypt it in order to recover even your infrastructure. Sprite Spider is one of the actors that has been most associated with this so far, but this is something that's going to continue to evolve, and we expect them to continue targeting Linux as well. We've seen more and more threat actors targeting Linux, looking at container environments and understanding how to target workloads. Beyond just the actual computer, they're looking at what is the computer running and how can they disrupt and most maximize the pain that they're causing in order to generate higher ransom demand. So there's 5 things that we tell customers to do in order to mitigate advanced ransomware attacks. The first one is easier said than done, and we've been talking about this for the last 20 years in security, which is secure the enterprise. By this, I mean using things like principle of least privilege, making sure that you have vulnerability management in place, that you're patching in predictable and informed ways, that you have all of these security layers and defense in depth inside of your enterprise that will make it a harder target. And for this, again, many organizations are still struggling to get there. So this is probably the number one thing that organizations can do. And it's not really something that's going to cost them a lot of money. It's just a lot of time and effort to get there. The second thing that we tell organizations is prepare to prevent. And CrowdStrike's been talking about something that we call the 1-10-60 rule, which is you have about a minute to identify a threat or an activity in your enterprise, about 10 minutes to investigate it, and about an hour to remediate it. And if you fit into that cadence, if you're able to kind of meet that goal, then you're going to be in a better position to stop these threat actors from moving across the enterprise and escalating privilege and deploying ransomware against the environment. And while that sounds like some pretty crazy numbers, with things like EDR and threat hunting, this is something that they can strive for, that threat hunters can kind of get into a cadence. And when they see something come up in the EDR, be able to investigate it and remediate very quickly will enable them to do so. And organizations that don't have the budget or the staffing to do this, because threat hunters are good threat hunters are hard to find, and they're expensive to keep on board and trained and engaged. Well, there's lots of threat managed hunting services out there. CrowdStrike Overwatch does this all day, every day, and is really on top of these types of threats. And even you can have something like our Falcon Complete service, where the threat hunters are authorized to remediate the activity as well. And you do this all through one platform, you can hit that 1-10-60 number. The third thing is next-gen protection, next-gen antivirus. Legacy antivirus solutions are not cutting it anymore. Signature-based detection is something that is extremely fragile. You have to understand the threat in order to have a signature for it, and then to use that signature to detect or prevent it. With next-gen antivirus technology, what we're talking about is using machine learning. Machine learning is classifying threats or files before they've ever encountered them. So they're looking at various features within that file and using that to classify it as good or bad. And that allows you to do prevention and detection without ever having seen this threat before. And that next generation technology is absolutely table stakes at this point in order to successfully protect an environment from these types of threats. Every ransomware intrusion is going to use some unique build that can be identified, but it's a unique build, and they're purposefully creating their intrusions and their tools to go around signature-based detection. So next-gen antivirus, absolutely critical. And the fourth thing is to drill. Now, this sounds a little bit odd maybe, but what we tell customers to do is to go through exercises, tabletop exercises, in order to understand if something happens, who are we going to call? Who's got the responsibility? If you've got the best backup solution in the world, but you've never tested it, then you're going to have a hard time when you need to deploy it under fire. And so by running these drills quarterly in virtual rooms, or eventually as we get back into offices doing it inside of a boardroom, are a really good way to get everybody to understand what they need to do, what their position is, and to build that muscle memory for what to do in a specific incident or when something happens. And finally, know your adversary. There's 25 different ransomware actors that we're tracking today. And if you understand their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures, what tools they're using and how they operate, then you're going to be in a much better position to defend your environment from those threat actors by understanding what business verticals they're targeting, what geographic regions they're targeting, and what you need to look for in order to stop them before they're able to encrypt files, steal data, and leak it on the internet. Thank you for your time today.